Hi, I want to thank Labroots for allowing me to share some things with you today. We call this talk the Contemporary Healer's Responsible Conversation because there is a certain amount of responsibility that healthcare providers have in a space that obviously, if we're talking about cannabis here, is federally illegal. So going through a high quality education involves us with certain attestations, the things we have to do that discuss in a commercial sense what we're going to talk about. And the standards for that involve revealing that if I'm going to discuss some product that is being used off-label, I disclose that. That's what that red box there you see is involving. And the fact is, because cannabis is a Schedule I substance, all of the things we're talking about today are by definition off-label. So with that disclaimer, I have no commercial ties, and this is a huge subject. It's involving things that seemingly can be complicated. So I hope in this next hour to be able to share with you some of those complicated subjects, in particular ones that look at the occurrence of something in the spirit of National Doctors' Day. Now, Doctors' Day is actually a real holiday, and I believe it was George Bush I who decided that there was going to be one day historically that could be used to represent the kindness and compassion that physicians provide in alleviating pain and suffering. And isn't it interesting that the date of March 30th was chosen? And that's because that's the date of the discovery of ether used as an anesthetic. Now, I'm an anesthesiologist, and the value of alleviating pain does not escape me in that back in the 1840s, actually in 1842, a medical student in Georgia State named Crawford Long, through observing the use of ether recreationally. It was known as ether frolics in the day and laughing gas nitrous oxide. These were sideshow carnival events. But it took that careful observation to see that if people took some ether, fell down perhaps in a way that looked like it would hurt, they got up and didn't seem to recall any pain. So in fact, Crawford Long then used ether and reported it to remove the cyst from the back of someone's neck. And as a result of that operational observation of initiative of seeing its use for pain, took something which was used recreationally and now has changed medicine forever. Pain is the first thing that I think if we look at as a quality of life and a compassionate outreach, it's important to understand that not all professionals are trained in treating pain the same way, or perhaps even the understanding of what really pain is. Pain can be physical, and that's the way most people think of it. But pain, if it's being regarded as an intolerable symptom of disease or an experience, has a different context. And in that sense, pain can be regarded as being not only physical, but psychological or even spiritual if it's truly intolerable. And that's a good starting point for which we can talk about the objectives of this talk. I'd like to be able to speak about plant-based medicines for a little while, but the real emphasis is not on the plant's chemistry itself, but on the receptors in all of us that the cannabis plant in this case reveal how it works and their role in maintaining the essential human physiologic balances we all depend on for health. Beyond there, we'll talk about the clinical significance of what we call evidence-based data. There's not as much of it as you would think, partly because of the constraints of prohibition. However, there are a wealth of anecdotal reports, and we'll compare just what the differences there are. And finally, we'll talk about the legislative progress that's been made throughout the country in the last 25 years, since the mid-1990s, when California became the very first state to recognize medical value to cannabis. There are now 33 states we'll talk about more. And the important thing about a medicine is that it needs to have responsible legislation that ensures promoting better patient outcomes. So historically then, with plants and medicine, the Nobel Prize back in 1947, Sir Robert Robinson received it for his work with a certain group of chemicals that are called alkaloids. Alkaloids are what are called water-soluble chemicals. Most botanical medicines we think of today come from alkaloid chemicals. The plants generally use these chemicals themselves for protecting themselves from predators, and also for ensuring its own reproduction and propagation. So an understanding of how certain plant chemicals also can benefit health were the contributions that Sir Robinson made, and that was awarded the Nobel Prize way back in 1947. And most of his productive work was done in the very beginning of the 20th century. So a slide that I'd like to share with you beyond that concerns the chemical structures, actually, of really the lifeblood, in a sense, of a plant, which is chlorophyll, compared to hemoglobin in human beings. And the two molecules, as seen side by side here, are virtually the same chemical structures, with the exception of what's in the middle here in these pictures. Human beings, to the picture on the right, rely on iron, such that hemoglobin, which is there to carry oxygen, it's essential, you couldn't live without it. All animals have some forms of hemoglobin, and a physician uses iron to fulfill hemoglobin's maximum capacity to do what it's designed to do, deliver oxygen. Plants, on the other hand, have their essential lifeblood in chlorophyll. Now, chlorophyll does a really interesting thing, and it was around long before hemoglobin in animals because plants were around first. It gives plants the ability to make their own food from light. And to do that, in the same place where iron fits in hemoglobin, plants have magnesium, actually related to iron in that they are both considered chemically as 2+ cations. Remarkably similar biochemistry plants and human beings share, and that's a powerful slide. The treatment of diseases, and particularly diseases of parasites, received the Nobel Prize recently, actually. It was in 2015. The Nobel Prize for Medicine in 2015 went to a plant-based chemical called artemisinin. And it, in fact, was rediscovered from ancient Chinese texts from thousands of years ago for its value treating parasitic diseases, including things like malaria. And parasitic diseases then, very often waterborne, kill thousands, if not millions, of human beings every year around the globe. And in this case, the rediscovery of that botanical medicine worthy of a Nobel Prize was awarded just within the last several years. It's particularly a timely comment because if anyone is following the news concerning COVID-19, and some news released even earlier today, understanding that this is going to be released in a few days from now, chloroquine is another example of an anti-parasitic medicine that's been used and has connections back to treating malaria through cinchona bark found in the New World, but basically developed through pharmacy in Victorian England days as the scourge of malaria was making the Thames River basically contaminated with malaria in what we regard today as being eradicated in London. The science involving cannabis, its chemicals itself, you can see from what we call here the biosynthesis of what chemicals lead to the cannabis's best known chemical components. In the blue square boxes, it shows THC and CBD here. Those are the two we know most about, but many of those other boxes include other, what are called cannabinoids, each having their own independent biologic functions. And in fact, the plant has them in an acid form that, if you look at the lower left of the legend, upon air and light and heat, the loss of the CO2 molecule called decarboxylation actually is what releases cannabis's best known psychotropic medicine, in this case, THC. And most of the concern about THC from a regulatory perspective is about that particular singular molecule, THC. This was an important discovery of THC's chemical structure that didn't come about until the early 1960s, compared to things like opium, which were known decades before for even chemical structures. So as we follow then the important discoveries of plant-based medicines, we can look way back, not to the modern plant that emphasizes THC, but to landrace fields that ethnobotanically cultures had grown for thousands of years at different points in the globe, very few of which still exist today. But one such field can be found in the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon. And it's interesting that in that field, the balanced amount of THC and CBD, otherwise we know it familiarly now as cannabidiol, were approximately in equal amounts. And that's particularly interesting because even today, a modern drug that has been introduced in, I believe, 29 countries across the world, called Sativex, or nabiximols is the generic name, is a preparation with equal parts of those two particularly better known cannabinoids. There's another component, though, of cannabis chemicals that has more recently gained a lot of appreciation for how it affects the particular user's impression upon what's the difference from one varietal of the plant to another in terms of its effect. And those are a family of chemicals called terpenes. Terpenes are those chemicals that plants use generally to their defensive advantage or their reproductive advantage, that are what give plants their smells. The most common terpene in nature is pinene it's called. And these chemicals, now we're learning much more about them, and certain dominant or recessive genetics in the varietals of cannabis that are seen today express different amounts of those terpenes. Terpenes then can be categorized and used in a purposeful way because those particular groups in that pinene class may have certain abilities to reverse some of the memory impairment that THC brings. Some of the other chemicals, including caryophyllene there, which is also found in black pepper, can have some wonderful anti-inflammatory effects. And other terpenes then do contribute to a given cannabis user's interpretation of those effects. But one plant that changed the world forever happens to be a plant that was found and identified in the early 1970s. This is Richard Evans Schultes, a very famous Harvard ethnobotanist, showing a broadleaf plant discovered in the Kandahar section of Afghanistan back then. It's a plant that had wide leaves, but nevertheless had lots of THC in it, lots of also a particular terpene called myrcene. And as you can see here, this is not a typical cannabis plant because a typical cannabis plant is towering over Dr. Schultes here. It would be in the neighborhood of 18, 20, 22 feet tall in one growing season. As you can see, these are 4 at most 5-foot squatty plants that also became favorites with people in the cannabis breeding world in these days and for the next several decades, because being of that size, they're easy to hide from a helicopter. And so the illegality of this lent this particular plant's genetics to be ones that are found in virtually all plants you'll see in the modern plant today. So that modern plant today, compared to back in the 1970s, has changed markedly. The amount of delta-9 THC, which is, as I said, the plant's really primary intoxicating chemical, its dry weight content back in the 1970s was probably not much more than, say, 3 or 4%. And today it's not uncommon, if you went into a dispensing point in those states where it's legal, to see plants that have been tested upwards of about 25% of THC. And that's actually quite a remarkable feat of cultivation, in that this is a secondary metabolite and the dry weight of one particular molecule. Cannabis has the concentration of those molecules developing in what are called buds. The flower bracts of the female plant have the greatest concentration. One of those buds is shown in this picture on the left. And the cannabinoids and the terpenes we spoke about a moment ago are manufactured and stored in tiny little structures known as capitate glandular trichomes. Those little structures you see over the word trichomes that look like either a golf ball on a tee or maybe a little mushroom. That's the chemical storage that the cannabis plant does. Those trichomes, if removed and separated from the rest of the leafy part of the plant, become the basis of the fats that are in there that would otherwise be hashish. So if we're looking critically then at a traditional plant, as those found in the landrace fields I mentioned before, compared to the modern plant, the traditional plants before the 70s kind of had a balance with them. And that evidence balance of naturalized balance of chemicals that were used by human beings for thousands of years throughout the world had an equal amount, more or less, between THC and CBD. However, since 1970s and the early discovery of that other plant, the emphasis, especially under prohibition, has been on that which is prohibited, THC, the intoxicating chemical. And right now, most modern plants hybrids emphasize those varieties with much more THC than CBD, which is being rediscovered, which is a good thing. However, it means that the dominant traits from that Afghani Kush I showed you the picture of a little while ago, and another varietal called Skunk Number 1, that happens to be the fragrance that it brings, created short hybrids with lots of THC, more than CBD, and in particular, high amounts of myrcene, which is a different terpene we can speak about a little more at length. So since that time then, the cannabis plant has not necessarily evolved, but it's changed markedly, so that over the last 50 years, that THC content of maybe 3 or 4, no more than 5% has skyrocketed up to 25%. However, CBD is also being rediscovered, and some modern plants today are actually pushing CBD's single secondary metabolite in certain plant varietals up to around 15%. The difference being either one being unbalanced, the two have different effects. Unbalanced THC has many notable side effects, while unbalanced still CBD, as of now, doesn't have many discernible side effects, which may represent a therapeutic benefit. So the comment on the evolution over the last 50 years is that we have really unbalanced modern plants that in a sense have actually devolved, probably from the way human beings had traditionally used cannabis as a medicine, going back with evidence, going back perhaps as far as 5,000 years ago. So when it's used, the other issue is that concentration. And the way that we treat patients is with using the lowest effective dose. So one of the problems that happens with the way patients are largely using cannabis today is that they're not starting with the lowest effective dose because the products are not really that low dose to begin with. So microdosing is something that's getting attention, and yet patients who use chronically are considerably more challenging to dose because their bodies are already used to higher dosing that changes the amounts of the body's own receptors that cannabis works through. However, there are certain balanced strains that are appearing now in certain dispensings, and those in that middle section there, the middle oval of balanced strains, represent perhaps lower concentrations of both CBD and THC, but represent a balance that's probably more consistent with how human beings evolved with cannabis over those thousands of years. So let's get right into the endocannabinoid receptors themselves, because they have a very unique way that they work, and they're critically important in maintaining the essential balances that our physiology relies on. Most physicians, even ones working in the cannabis space, have not fully put themselves to task to understand some of these subtle ways that the body's own endogenous, we call it, receptors work. And that's going to be a major emphasis of one of the objectives now, to bring that about and that important discovery. The discovery of THC wasn't until 1964. And the lab that discovered that belonged to Professor Raphael Mechoulam at Emory University in Israel. But the most important discovery in terms of understanding endocannabinoid science happened in that same lab nearly 30 years later. Mechoulam's lab identified the body's own chemicals that THC is mimicking. And that's an important distinction, because when people say, oh, well, the body's chemicals are mimicking THC, no, it's the other way around. You have a plant-derived chemical that, whether through a fluke of nature or something that plants know, in a sense, could interact with not only mammals, but endocannabinoids are found in all animals, at least not only vertebrates, but also invertebrates. Insects have a different system, but all animals have endocannabinoids. And it's almost that the word cannabinoid in this sense can be misleading, in that it makes you think it's somehow doing what cannabis is doing. Cannabis is doing some of the things that the body's natural system does. And that became a teaching learning moment. So by far, compared to the 1964 discovery, 30 years later, the discovery of anandamide and 2-AG, the body's two best known and initial endocannabinoids, is far more powerful and meaningful to medicine's further advances this way. Professor Mechoulam is still alive and well. He's 89 years old, and his contributions in this field cannot be overstated. So endocannabinoids were revealed through the cannabis plant, but there are actually three very well-known receptor systems that we all have that were identified through plant chemicals, not just cannabis, but other chemical plants that had been used for thousands of years, indigenous people as well as pharmaceuticals, including opioids. Morphine, or the opium poppy, is what was used to originally discover the existence of what we know as endorphins, discovered in the mid-1970s, cannabinoids in the mid-1990s, and even the chili pepper, capsaicin, is known to have been used by cultures thousands of years ago, still is used therapeutically for pain management, and it works through a third system called endovaniloids. There are things called TRPV1 receptors. They work through this mechanism, and the interactions of how our bodies deal with all three of these receptor systems is therapeutic for the perception of pain. This is particularly important because this is not new in the sense that pharmaceutical companies have been using these concepts even before the discovery of how they were working was appreciated. So there are medicines going back to the turn of the last century and certainly through the 1930s, which exploited the use of these three chemicals for use as an elixir. It doesn't mean it couldn't have been abused, because they were, but certain chemicals that all the major pharmaceutical companies had in their formulary decades ago took advantage of these receptor systems' functions in the perception of pain long before precisely how they worked was ever appreciated. If there was ever one report that got my attention to the power of what endocannabinoids can cover as far as treating diseases, it was a paper that was produced through the NIH that summarized the importance of how this system in human health modulates disease. That means keeps us in balance. And this paper from the NIH was put together by two highly respected MD PhD researchers, Paul Packer and George Kunos. And I've highlighted in the bottom of the paper something we'll enlarge here a moment, the most remarkable statement. They said that modulating or working with the endocannabinoid system activity may have therapeutic potential in almost all diseases affecting humans. I'll say that again, almost all diseases affecting humans. This is saying how essential it is as a parallel system, say, to our immune system, and we'll go over more exactly on how this works in a little while. But this explains how people say that cannabis can be used for something such as Parkinson's disease, a brain disease, and yet still cannabis could conceivably be effective for, say, Crohn's disease. While people who don't understand how the mechanism of this system works could ever have something that's a brain-related disease affect with a gut-related disease, as I just described, this is why and how it happens. The fact is that all other receptor systems are subordinate to the effects of the endocannabinoid system. And I'll show you what some of those receptor systems are in a little while. The subtitle of that paper was actually targeting the endocannabinoid system. And I want to point out the importance of that there, because unless you understand as a biological basis how and why this system does what it does, it can be very challenging to interpret the limited evidence-based data that still exists at this moment in time with respect to cannabis when used as a medicine. So a purely focused researcher, and I've drawn the analogy of an archer here, if the archer is able to maintain pure focus on the target, as you see there, they're likely to shoot right where they're wanting to research. However, if their gaze is distracted, as I've pointed a cannabis leaf on the tip of the arrow, and they're focusing on the arrow tip and not the target, far more likely to shoot misses. So focused research is that focused research where the focus is not so much on the plant, especially for future value, but on the endogenous endocannabinoid system itself. And this is how it works. This is a very beautiful slide by a company named PHYTOCANNABINOID. And what it shows is the receptors as CB1 listed in the center of this slide. But it's positioned in what we call a synapse, the part of the nerve that brings a signal down from what would otherwise be the top of this screen, gets transmitted through one nerve, and then gets picked up by another nerve, which is the bottom portion of the screen's surface. So there's a space called the synapse that exists between these nerves, and nerve signals get transmitted from, in this case, the top to the bottom by sending different, in this case, neurotransmitters from the first part of that nerve to get picked up on the second side, on the bottom, and then that nerve in turn transmits the signal further. Well, it doesn't matter what the neurotransmitter is, acetylcholine, dopamine, melatonin. We have a lot of different medicines that are regarded as neurotransmitters and systems we understand that way, but all of them are affected by the action of the cannabinoid receptors, CB1 pictured here, on them. So here's what's unique about this system. To begin with, nerves are fat. They're lipids. And so unlike the alkaloid medicines that I showed you in an earlier slide were identified for their importance to healthcare and awarded that way in the 1940s by a Nobel Prize, cannabinoids are different, and cannabis is different because they are not what are called water-soluble alkaloids. These are fats or lipids. And so the environment around a synapse in a nerve is in fact a lipid environment. And so what's happening now is that the body's own cannabinoids, the ones that I said THC is mimicking, can be seen on the bottom surface here. And they're going to be seen, I'll bring up a little circle around them. The two endogenous cannabinoids called anandamide and 2-AG can be seen where they're actually made on the postsynaptic neuron's surface, and they respond to whatever neurotransmitters are going down and affecting that postsynaptic neuron, and then they are made on site and on demand, right where they are, and they go backwards, retrograde to the presynaptic side to then affect whatever is being released. And that's a constant fine-tuning balance that not only each nerve, but every physiologic system is affected by, that's now understood to operate through this mechanism. In medical school, we're generally taught that nerve impulses, whether from the brain through the spinal cord, back and forth, are sort of regarded like one-way streets. Well, they're really not one way at all, because at every single junction here, every single synapse, there's actually a little feedback loop that keeps us in constant balance. And that's a key difference compared to THC, which you can see in the green color there, is coming in and affecting CB receptors, but not in a way that maintains necessarily a balance. THC's impact is not produced on site and on demand. When taken in, its effects tend to be more global within all parts of the body and mind. And its effects, instead of being rather instantaneous and degraded very quickly by the body's own enzymes, its effects can last for several hours. So in many respects, THC is mimicking only some of the effects of the body's own endocannabinoids, and not in necessarily a natural way at all, because we're talking about how it compares to two natural ligands. So be very careful when someone implies that, oh, well, cannabis is a natural substance, therefore it's good for you. Not all natural substances are necessarily good, but it certainly does work through a natural pathway. And it affects everything. These, as of 2013, represent the other known receptor systems that influence all physiologic systems, I've identified up in the top left corner there the two CB receptors labeled CB1 and CB2, and mentioning those two natural ligands, the things that interface with those receptors naturally, affecting everything that is known for our physiology. So that's why when you see someone talk about the brain's effects versus what it does elsewhere in the body, you'll see what we are calling here central versus peripheral effects, and how wide their effects can be seen from what naturally is happening through endocannabinoids. So let's get into the second of our objectives, talking about the clinical significance of what we call evidence-based data as compared to anecdotal reports. We know an awful lot about anecdotal reports, but what happens when we're confronted with the volume and wealth of them, and they're not scrutinized perhaps as carefully through the scientific method? What happens is that anecdotal reports can contribute to hyperbole. And hyperbole on what cannabis and cannabis's chemicals can do is running rampant. And I caution healers or patients when they're looking at some of these reports to measure that against the slowly evolving but ever-present evidence-based data that actually does exist today. So the best reference for a current evidence-based data platform that I encourage you to look at would be a commissioned federal report that was released in early 2017 by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, looking specifically at the health effects of cannabis and cannabinoids. This was not the first commissioned federal report. The first report that would have covered this also extensively was released back in 1999, barely half a decade from the discovery of the endocannabinoid system itself. And even that earlier report commented on its potential effects. But by the time this report came out in 2017, it was very helpful because it now distinguished between evidence-based data and those anecdotal reports. And what I've done in this slide, I've made a few comments from fairly well-respected references talking about what is known and accepted today, or should be, about the importance of how cannabis can help human beings. The first being a quote from the National Institute of Health, and that was saying up there on the top that modulating the endocannabinoid system activity, as I showed you on that report paper earlier, may have therapeutic potential in almost all diseases affecting humans. Nevertheless, at this moment in time, in 2020, the New England Journal made a statement back in 2013 that largely still applies in terms of that cannabis is not a first-line treatment for debilitating diseases. And the reason I reference that is because cannabis, if it's regarded as an alternative medicine, kind of implies that it's rejecting the advances that Western medicine has made in both its diagnostic and therapeutic advances. Well, Western medicine and Eastern medicine meet in terms of a concept, or not even a concept, but the practice of what we consider as integrative medicine, where the Eastern healers' understanding, in particular of plant-based medicines, is absolutely important. But when it's combined with Western medicine's scientific method and due process to determine evidence-based data, then you really have the best of what both cultural and the advances of healthcare have realized. And so the advances in terms of the evidence-based data as it exists and we know today is summarized in the statements I've listed here for THC, CBD, as well as the other cannabinoids, in terms of what it seems that it has the best efficacy for. Particularly, there is conclusive evidence that it works for the chemotherapy-related nausea and vomiting. And culturally, what we found is that for other entities, wasting diseases, things like that, nausea and vomiting is something that is well known to improve with cannabinoids, THC in particular. And why is that important? Well, we're going to sort of give a little segue here to talking about legislation. But the reality of legislative measures are they've been made much more effective through a politically successful mantra of compassion. physicians are compassionate. Of course we are. We don't go to school to learn how to take care of patients and render safe and effective healthcare if we weren't compassionate. But the scientific method, by definition, is dispassionate. It doesn't consider those emotions. Certainly not being compassionate is not consistent with a humane way of approaching disease and treatment. But in that sense, I want to give you some historical basis for some of the earliest understanding for how cannabis can be helpful for nausea and vomiting, because it was actually recognized that way going back 30, 40 years ago, when early patients who developed AIDS and HIV-related symptoms had to tolerate certain medicines which were very, very hard on stomachs. And the nausea and vomiting of those wasting disorders were treated with cannabis in the forms of actually brownies back then. And there seemed to be efficacy from it that has been evidenced then as well as continued today. That is the evidence of a compassionate care mantra that was really not in those days advanced as successfully politically, because our understanding of HIV and AIDS and who was afflicted back then didn't really have the compassionate understanding of who was getting the disease from what. However, jump forward 30 years, and now we have children with epilepsy, and the compassionate use of the different cannabinoid, in this case, cannabidiol, is what's referenced there in that second column there, where its efficacy has evidence-based data to show that there is conclusive proof that it works, particularly for intractable epilepsy. Why do I mention that? Because an epileptic should not completely stop using the medicines that may be working or currently advised with their neurologist or epileptologist taking care of them, but perhaps for certain patients having intractable epilepsy, as occurs with children with diseases such as Dravet syndrome or Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, two very, very challenging forms of epilepsy to treat, seemingly has evidence-based data developing now for the benefits of cannabidiol. Cannabidiol, by the way, also can be helpful for other things, anxiety and inflammation, as far as its effects in even treating or in certain situations making worse certain diseases involving psychoses and schizophrenia are still things where our psychiatric colleagues are dealing with understanding CBD better, but it does apparently have some efficacy without bringing the side effects of THC with it. THC, however, going right back to that other THC comment, is shown to have not necessarily conclusive supporting evidence, but substantial evidence, as it's been categorized in that 2017 report, for its efficacy and help for chronic pain. We do right now a fairly poor job in treating chronic pain, as evidenced from the side effects, both gastrointestinal and central, of opioids. And today's concerns with accidental opioid overdose deaths bring that to light. And I'll share with you then, beyond the epileptic child, there's a third compassionate care mantra evolving in the use of cannabis for veterans, and veterans who may not have choices that are different than opioids or other drugs that have certainly significant side effects. Cannabis now for the use in veterans is being discovered, and some of that dates back to the days of Vietnam, where cannabis was discovered by certain GIs in Vietnam. Again, this is not that distant history, but ones which now allow us to rediscover it in the context of understanding the mechanism for how these work, which were not known back then. And then finally, we bring up what cannabinoids might be helpful for. The future looks kind of exciting with respect to the types of pain from lower urinary tract issues, perhaps hepatitis C, cancer pain, and fibromyalgia. However, in contrast, even though it can lower eye pressure, as seen in glaucoma, the medicines that are available today to treat glaucoma would have cannabis used because of its side effects and how long or short, in this case, its duration is, that the eye drops available to treat multiple forms of glaucoma seem to be much better choice than cannabis for that particular disease. That maybe, unfortunately, in states which have advanced certain qualifying conditions, include glaucoma in that context. Perhaps the same thing with ALS and perhaps even Parkinson's disease. But everything else at this moment is what we said before is anecdotal. These are reports that are available for their interpretation and the supporting evidence-based data at this time. This slide discusses the available formularies that are here in 2020. And I'd like you just quickly to look at this slide relative to the last column on the right. The Drug Enforcement Administration, or DEA of the United States, has scheduling of different drugs, either that are prohibited, which is the definition really of Schedule 1. We can go into detail if someone's interested. But more importantly, Schedule 5 at the bottom right-hand corner is a new designation for cannabidiol. A company out of England has cannabidiol in an oil extract form produced as a product called Epidiolex that has recently received FDA approval for treatment of that intractable epilepsy we talked about a little while ago. This is important in that it becomes the very first plant-based cannabinoid approved through our Food and Drug Administration, which is the higher standard that we provide for introducing new medicines. I'd like now to shift to a model that I use when I'm teaching about how and why endocannabinoids are so important and what they do. So perhaps the hardest thing for those listening as I present these next few slides, I believe there's about 8 slides, will be to try to think about what I'm speaking about, but not necessarily in context with what you may be familiar about with cannabis use. And yet some of the things I'll say will be obvious and I'll refer to it in that context. The reason I'm going back to 1998 for this particular article is because not Professor Mishulam, but I believe the most frequently cited researcher in the world is an Italian researcher named Vincenzo Di Marzo. And back in 1998, barely 3 to 5 years after these receptors and the body's own chemicals, again, that THC is mimicking, he said that some of the functions that body's own cannabinoids are doing are things that relate to relaxing, eating, sleeping, forgetting, and protecting. These are those messages. And so I'd like to present a clinical model, not necessarily approaching these in the order that I brought up here, but in terms of how we grow. So from conception right through death, CB or cannabinoid receptors are essential to our well-being because, as I said before, they have effect in that their function modulates or subtly adjusts all the other physiology that's going on in us in an effort to sustain life. So what do I mean when I say that? Let's look at conception then and realize that if we look at those 5 things, that when we're living and when we're growing in particular, we start with conception, and then the importance of eating and sleeping for normal growth as we're developing and growing is pretty obvious. But as we accrue life's experiences and the different stressors that nature, disease, and everything else brings us, we have to have the abilities to relax and, in a sense, forget some of those trials and tribulations in order to go on. Then finally, I've left the bottom blank for now, but near CB2 receptors, which are different. CB2 receptors are different in that they're not only involved with the nervous system, but they're involved with ways that help protect us. Because CB2 receptors, even though we know much less about them than CB1 receptors, they are there to respond when and where a disease hits. And right now, I assure you that people who have healthy endocannabinoid systems may be in a position to better deal with a new disease that human beings have not had to deal with, COVID, the novel coronavirus that you hear so much about today. It doesn't mean that cannabis is helpful for you. It means that your general health through having a healthy endocannabinoid system's response to that disease is what's there that's designed along with your immune system to help fight the effects of disease, where the immune system, just about by definition, is there to approach certain bacterial and viral protein invaders. The CB2 endocannabinoid receptor system is there to respond to the event and evolution of a disease, to keep that disease from essentially killing you quickly. If you want to think about it in this context, then CB2 receptors and this system is the system that allows a disease to become chronic. To understand the mechanism of how a disease becomes chronic, or the mechanism of chronicity, is the starting blocks for incredible research that's going to happen. Perhaps more than a generation's worth of research will be focused on CB2, probably more than CB1 in the distance. Because without the fine balance of keeping us in balance, which is why the CB2 receptor is put on a little triangle that maintains that delicate balance, death ensues. And without a healthy immune system or endocannabinoid system, life is virtually impossible. So let's look at these individual relax, eat, sleep, forget, and protect things from the order in which they should be obviously important in terms of eating and sleeping. Obviously, conception, a young mother, a child, they have to be able to eat and sleep simply to start life. And so the essential nature of CB1 receptors in this context for growth and reproduction should be obvious. If we advance then beyond the growth years, remember, usually by the time you're born or by the time you're conceived, cells duplicate and we grow somewhere till around the late teens, early 20s. What happens after that is we need to maintain our health. And so obviously we don't pass away at age 20, we just start to hit our stride. So for growth and development, in particular perhaps with nutrition, endocannabinoids explain a holistic but very elusive scientific understanding of what's been called for decades the brain-gut connection. If we go further then and look at relaxing as compared to the eating and sleeping, which is the way many people think of cannabis today. Most people who use cannabis therapeutically tend to use it before bedtime. And certainly cannabis's effects on eating, people think of the munchies. But again, try not to think about it in terms of cannabis. Think about this in context of evolution, survival, growth. Think about the importance now of relaxing, because it really ensures our ability to recover from life's relentless stressors. While this guy might be looking like he's just sitting back there chilling, and I can't tell you for sure because I didn't take the picture if he's had any cannabis, he's doing what the body naturally does through its body's own cannabinoids, and that's relaxing. Without the ability to relax, we wouldn't be able to calm down and to basically control how the different stressors of life affect us. So that's the importance of relaxing. One of the more fascinating, though, components of how cannabinoids work is they actually work at parts of our brain contributing to our ability to forget. And those parts of the brain are actually located in a similar region to where that eraser is, but it's not simply an inconvenience. Being able to forget, it's an ability, and it's actually essential for survival. So when I give talks about how important it is to be able to forget, I want to tell you that naturally, it doesn't happen through cannabis, although many people who use cannabis, in particular, you would think of patients perhaps trying to keep an unpleasant memory from recurring, use cannabis to, in a sense, help to forget, but that's not the natural way the body's designed. And the receptors that are found in parts of the brain, in particular the hippocampus and the amygdala, which deal with emotions and memories, are essential to the way a healthy human being forgets certain things. Now, I'd like to go a little deeper into this now for a moment, because this field can be fascinating on many respects. The ability to forget is determined through cannabinoids. And if we're going to give an example of how important it is to forget, why don't we think about those stressors that are not related to cannabis, but perhaps encountered by an ancient tribe of nomadic human beings long before cannabis was known or present to where it's being used. Let's pretend if we were all that nomadic tribe and we were foraging for survival to find a squirrel or a fish or something just to survive that day. And out of nowhere comes a terrifying beast, chases us. We scamper up a tree, we're hungry, maybe we're bleeding, our muscles are tight, our hearts are pounding. If when nightfall comes, we can't recover by relaxing, falling to sleep, and perhaps most importantly, forgetting the sheer terror of that moment, we may not be able the following morning perhaps to get out of that tree we've hidden in, to escape. And once that animal comes back and sees us trapped up there, our survival is not likely. So the ability to forget incredibly stressful moments is hardwired into us through cannabinoids, our body's own cannabinoids. That's really something that could go to the essence of post-traumatic stress disorders, for an understanding, perhaps again, of why people who are afflicted with that may find cannabis to be helpful therapeutically. So that's only talking about it in terms of its effects on the stresses of pain. But we also incur certain experiences in life that are actually pleasurable. And it's not necessarily helpful to remember the extremes of pleasure either. I have a slide coming up a few slides from now that may present where that intersection is, and I'll segue into that in just a moment. But the way that these receptors work naturally in us was revealed in a very interesting way for forgetting and memory in a case report that presented last year. And it involved a lady. With modern genetics, we now can identify certain genetic variants that sometimes are very helpful in revealing how the body's own system works. And in this case, a lady in Scotland reported that as an adult, she went through a life of really not feeling that painful things, dentist work, even the thing that called this to the attention was a painful orthopedic surgery procedure on her wrist. She didn't need the normal medicines or perceive pain as an uncomfortable experience the way really virtually everybody else does. And she also tested in an interesting way in that certain psychological tests that are there to designed to assess anxiety. She scored virtually a 0 on those tests, which is unheard of. So here you have a case report of an individual who really doesn't feel pain or anxiety, that very often they go hand in hand, like other human beings. And when they looked at her genetics, they found that she's missing something that breaks down anandamide. FA, fatty acid amide hydrolase, is the enzyme that we all have that breaks down our body's own endogenous cannabinoid called anandamide. And so she presumably has a very high circulating level of that particular chemical in her that presents her with having these particular effects seen out of proportion with things that should necessarily be healthy, because she's not a necessarily a healthy person at all. If she touches something, she likely has experiences with pain where she doesn't respond and can worsen an injury, or anxiety from things that should evoke a certain amount of anxiety isn't felt by her. But equally interesting is in context with what we were just speaking about with being able to remember things, the ability to forget. She actually has significant problems with memory and memory impairment. So here you have a genetic exception that gives validity to the way we understand, at least the teaching model that I'm presenting here for the importance of being able to forget. So in terms of not simply pleasure, but I mentioned before about pain. Pain is actually also something that we mentioned a moment ago is important to forget. But what about pleasure? And what about if we were to say a moment that same analogy to an ancient or prehistoric tribe where people derived pleasure not by finding drugs to abuse or things like that, but the way human beings still derive pleasure, which could be through sex. The ability for a group as a nomadic tribe to be able to forget not simply painful and stressful things, but the ability perhaps to forget the extremes of pleasure are also hardwired in us. And in fact, when you think about not being able to forget extremes of pleasure, in contrast to a patient who could not forget extremes of pain like PTSD and are constantly trying to avoid it to a non-helpful level or non-therapeutic point, those people that might not be able to forget the extremes of pleasure and are constantly seeking it have their own issues, and potentially that may be one of the causations of dependency and different types of addictions. So the interesting point here is I've had some fascinating discussions, including with Professor Meshulam, about hundreds of chemicals that exist in our brains that resemble some of these endogenous cannabinoids that we have in us. And their chemical structures are fascinating to think how they might be interacting, maybe in this same area of the brain where these forgetful, not necessarily forgetful, but abilities to forget are harnessed. And isn't it interesting that, at least as far as what Meshulam says, he doesn't think that God just put those hundreds of chemicals there for the fun of it. So what we might be looking at least theoretically, but it's a fascinating subject, is that if they are there and they're involved in our abilities to deal with these stressors of life, whether pleasure or pain, and what we choose to forget, the differences that you as an individual might have versus myself or anybody else you meet with life's experiences in terms of what we seek or reject, pleasure or pain, are really the principal components of our personality. And we know very little about the biochemical basis for personality, and I'm growing more and more convinced that it may lie within the science of endocannabinoids. So as we move on then to the last of the 5 things that DeMarzo mentioned, we now are shifting to CB2 receptors, the ones that I said in many respects we know less about, but may be critically important for understanding how diseases we encounter become chronic. And in fact, that's what happens with advancing age. We rely on those CB2 receptors to respond and mitigate the progression of disease. The reason that's important is when we pass on our death certificate, there's usually one disease that's listed as our cause of death, but along with it, we generally die with many diseases that are held in a chronic state that we die with, but not directly from. The reason we can die with them is because we have a healthy, working, functional cannabinoid system that are working through CB2 receptors here. That should pretty much differentiate between the other components of the importance of eating and sleeping and relaxing and forgetting. CB1 functions generally is the way I like to think of that, versus CB2 receptors there to protect us. So this is a good slide because here it shows CB2 receptors in an arteriole, and it mentions some of the things that CB2 receptors do for showing how blood can flow, cellular proliferation, the endothelial cell activation. These CB receptors are found throughout the body, with one notable exception. CB receptors are not found in the portion of the brainstem called the medulla and pons that's dedicated to respiration. It's the area of the brain which allows you to have the stimulation to breathe. So unlike endorphin receptors, which respond to narcotics, which is the source for how come you'll have these accidental opioid overdose deaths, where with enough opioids, people's brainstem is affected and they are not able to respond by breathing. That when one can't breathe, and this is an anesthesiologist speaking, nothing else matters. You don't see respiratory depression producing a fatal outcome purely from cannabinoids or cannabis, even with doses exceeding tens of thousands of times normal therapeutic doses, and that brings a different element of safety profile for that lethal outcome. Now, that's not to say that it doesn't cause irresponsible action or falling asleep while at the wheel. People, of course, have died, but it's not from the mechanism of overdosing that we see, especially with opioids and other drugs that affect the respiratory drive sections of the brain. Nevertheless, CB2 receptors exist, and even ancient cultures would have had a knowledge of this in a sense. And that's what this slide is meant to show. This is what's called a PET scan. And if you look very closely, it's not just the areas that are red and orange colored, but I'd like you to look at all the colored areas, not the dark blue background or black. But you'll see by one of the hands, there's a little red spot, not the largest on the screen, but where the hand would be. That's an intravenous site where a particular chemical that's meant to engage CB2 receptors had an IV site, and this preparation was injected. And 2 hours later, this PET scan finds out where did that chemical actually engage CB2 receptors. And you'll see it's not in the brain. It's not so much in the heart and the lungs as the driving force of what's up in the chest. It's essentially located in the gut, and that's where the immune system is. So this is a parallel system to the immune system, which we know is essential to our well-being. The orange colors are more representative also of the blood flow, still bringing this there. So the area of the liver, which is the largest red section, even the kidneys and certain orange areas, is not the teaching moment here. It's that life forces for endocannabinoids as well as the immune system tend to be things that are in the gut. Even ancient Chinese understood this, because if you look at acupuncture and how whatever is understood about acupuncture, which was not understood hundreds of years ago, it involves a concept of wellness called qi. It's spelled QI, but pronounced qi. And we know that qi represents flow in and out of different parts of the body. And even though this is not the way we teach medicine in Western cultures, this is Eastern medicine's philosophy that the flow of energy through the body is what sustains life. Most of the flow in qi goes through the abdomen, through these same places of the gut, even though back then an ancient healer would have no concept of CB2 receptors or having intravenous and PET scans. This, in essence, then, is the parallel to the immune system, which we know is responsible for immunity and life. So what I've just described is really Western medicine's new science future meeting Eastern medicine's traditional past as far as how we understand what I inferred before we call integrative medicine. And so if there ever was a smoking gun, in my opinion, that brings Eastern and Western medicine's understanding of health together, it quite possibly could be that PET scan on the left. So let's get right into the last of the objectives and talk for a moment about legislation promoting better patient outcome. Currently, there are 33 states and DC that have medical cannabis laws, and 11 having legal recreational use of marijuana in certain states. I'm from Florida, and Florida now has addressed their concerns with these accidental opioid deaths, because it's actually mandated here that non-opioid alternatives must be discussed with patients before initiating an opioid treatment regimen. This is an important understanding. And as a physician, I would hope that physicians have the responsible ability, especially in states where it's legal, but eventually federally, to have that extra arrow in their quiver that may be cannabinoid medicines to use therapeutically, in particular because the evidence-based data currently, as I showed you on the previous slide, supports that there is substantial evidence-based data today to support the use of cannabis for chronic pain. And that is something we could learn a lot about. And yet the physicians who are getting into this field now undergo extra scrutiny. And it's likely because of it still being federally illegal. And it's not simply from government health officials or only federal agencies, but our own colleagues might give extra skepticism to a physician who sees someone for the practice of cannabinoid medicine. And this presents a conflict because physicians in states where it's legal are doing it, perhaps seeing patients in that state because they have a license to practice medicine in that state. But they have a second license, and that's their DEA license, which is a federal standard. And not that many physicians in 2020 have yet embraced seeing patients for medical cannabis out of any risk whatsoever, as it may be regarded, to their federal license, their DEA license, which is our ability to prescribe medicines. That's our tool bag. So it's understandable why, as long as cannabis remains federally prohibited, that many physicians are not prepared to see patients who are seeking cannabis. So where does it put somebody like this guy? This came out several years ago here in Florida. Frankly, the lady could have been my mom. And yet this physician doesn't have the benefit perhaps of those listening to this talk or keynote, because immediately there seems to be, at least in past years, a knee-jerk response that is not educated in 2020 of offering narcotics, in this case, OxyContin. I would hope that physicians are not regarded this way because this physician looks bored and uneducated, and this is not the current practice of medicine. So in an effort to try to look at the benefits of natural medicines and the importance of doing the right thing, all physicians take an oath. And it used to be the Hippocratic Oath, perhaps the Oath of Maimonides, which is one that I took when I graduated school many years ago. But I've been honored to give the oath of medicine at my institution to tell physicians right from wrong. And I think there is what's called a bioethical basis from which we can proceed on this, because the challenge ethically is to suggest, should a physician offer compassionate access to cannabis for its use of a medicine while it remains under federal prohibition? And the way we generally look at issues that are medical legal are through existing medical legal ethical platforms and opinions, of which the AMA, the American Medical Association, does have a position that says a physician shall respect the law and also recognize a responsibility to seek changes in those requirements that are contrary to the best interests of the patient. That applies in certain areas, but unfortunately, that mindset has not particularly been helpful in dealing with the ethical challenges surrounding cannabis for just the reasons we covered a moment ago. And that's that there is a different federal standard that in this case, physicians are not likely to extend their efforts on a federal level and change laws that way because of how they get unfairly scrutinized perhaps by their colleagues and the importance of that DEA license to their practice. Nevertheless, a bioethical approach is a bit different, because bioethics don't simply take medical legal ethics as a discussion between doctors and lawyers. Bioethics involves the full community. And from that sense, I mean not only doctors and lawyers, but educators, patients, clergy, government. Everyone contributes to a society's understanding of a bioethical approach to solving a problem that has an ethical basis. You can think of other things. Right to life deserves a bioethical platform. Even stem cells and the development that started stem cell research off over a decade ago, which originally was restricted with only certain cell lines being able to be used. It took a bioethical rationale and process through reasoning that now has stem cell technology available. It's saving hundreds, thousands of lives through a technology that had to go through that same bioethical process. So with respect to cannabis and bioethics, sometimes it helps to come up with not necessarily a compromise between medical and legal, but a platform from which to say, do the right thing. And so I wanted to put two sentences together that present a rationale. This first sentence from the perspective of a patient seeking relief. And I didn't say pain here. I said an intolerable symptom of disease or an intolerable experience. Seeking relief from that is a human natural instinct. And I'm convinced that that contributes to many substances' therapeutic use, whether legal or illegal. And it's just the way human beings seem to behave. I accept that in a patient who comes with that type of a background. What then becomes of the physician's approach or the healer's approach is to go right back to the basics and say that the treatment of those intolerable symptoms is the task that society bestows upon its healers to provide humane relief. More than that rationale, I'm not sure is needed to progress with the whole disposition that has had this type of an approach sort of stymied over the last 50 years, which is how many years the current designation of cannabis as a Schedule I prohibited substance has been there, even though its knowledge base for the last 25 has had the benefit of the supporting science to understand how and why it works. Why is this discussion particularly important now? Because when we look at the interest of public health, and right now our public health concerns are dedicated and focused on coronavirus, nevertheless, when we look over the last 15 years at the leading causes of preventable death, of which coronavirus has just been around for perhaps 15 weeks, drug abuse all the way to the right, which was back then relatively low down, 9th or 10th in terms of the causes of preventable death, and smoking have actually advanced in different directions over the last 15 years. Because of those changes in education and information we have now about both smoking and drug abuse, the differences of what trends now over the last 15 years is we see a public health victory. Tobacco smoking in the United States is nowhere near as common as it was years ago, and yet it is still by far the leading cause of preventable death globally. Drug abuse, on the other hand, in the last 15 years, has absolutely had an impact on society through lethal opioid overdoses that over these past 15 years has now passed both motor vehicle collisions and firearm deaths. And with all the attention that we've paid to reducing motor vehicle collisions and firearm deaths, it's quite remarkable that we haven't really controlled drug abuse deaths by using all of those tools we may have available in that arrow quiver analogy I gave a little while ago. So furthering then in terms of public health and what a responsible state medical program would include for responsible legislation, I like to think of this in terms of what things could be in responsible legislation that impact a given patient's outcome for the better. And for those of you who may or may not be able to read on your phone or laptop these 7 points, I'm just going to read them one at a time by telling you that there are states now that are considering these 7 potential things to add to their state's legislation that ultimately would be regarded as a federal necessity once cannabis comes out of federal prohibition. And the first is developing a responsible initial standard of care from which physicians entering this space can practice medicine by. So practitioner oversight by boards of medicine have to have an initial standard of care rather than having a standard of care developed from a lowest common accepted standard. It needs to be regarded as having what would be the next higher standard that physicians can provide in this understanding that it's an evolving field. Second would be continuous quality improvement. Now, what do I mean by that? Continuous quality improvement metrics are used in everything in healthcare currently. Hospitals, nursing homes, pharmacies, everything in healthcare goes through an accreditation process whereby when there is an unfavorable outcome, that information is shared proactively throughout healthcare so that we try to make it so that we redesign things so as not to repeat that unfavorable patient outcome. And to a certain extent, legislators that ignore the importance of an accreditation program that approaches healthcare this way through continuous quality improvement could be hard-pressed to explain why without this they were allowing bad outcomes to recur. We don't hear much about too many bad outcomes yet, but as data becomes tracked, I'm certain we'll be hearing about more. The third item here is to initially constrain conditions by lending the evidence-based data of these conclusive high-quality findings that are conclusive or substantial for what it actually works for, and we covered those before. Now, that doesn't dismiss anecdotal reports, which become the basis for the hypotheses of future research. But there is a difference with that evidence-based data versus anecdotal reports, and to recognize, though, to initially, responsibly, and judiciously start to release approved things rather than having a virtual everything list that fits for a qualifying condition, I believe is not only a more responsible way to allow this to progress, but one in which the federal government would embrace rather than allowing disease states which may not yet have the benefit of that evidence-based data. Then finally, on item 4, this requires funded research. And in particular, with the way cannabis is understood today, outcomes in children is particularly important because this alludes to the importance of what are called long-term or longitudinal studies, which we have very, very few of. So it's not simply for treating a child with epilepsy right now, but to look at the long-term effects of when people use cannabis, what are the differences as they mature and develop those skills that allow them to deal with problem solving that has previously been connected in perhaps one of the very few longitudinal studies that was not perfect, but inferred and concluded that there could be a drop of intelligence that would be of great concern to those children that started at a young age using cannabis and continued using it in high doses consistently for the next 20 years. We need these 20-year and more studies of following one individual to really determine the consequences of outcome, because we know very little about two things concerning modern cannabis. One is the effective dosing, other than making a general statement that the current evidence-based data suggests that we grossly overdose and that most findings suggest that minimal doses are most effective, with the possible exception as evidence builds for PTSD. And the second thing we know very, very little about are the long-term effects on what's called down-regulating, when we change the system's normal complement of receptors by exposing them to cannabis and cannabinoids on a chronic basis. What we do know that's encouraging is that this particular receptor system tends to be very plastic in its nature, which means that it has a very high ability to recover its full complement of receptors, because a federal study in NIDA, the National Institute of Drug Abuse, looked at people who were chronic heavy users that were sequestered and not given any cannabis products in a controlled setting. And after only about 4 weeks, they had a near total return of all their body's full complement of these receptors. That's helpful information to determine how these receptors may be affected from long-term use. Then, of course, if you look at different states, the fifth item here about the full and accurate labeling of cannabis products is absolutely needed to facilitate meaningful data accession, both for the benefit of researchers as well as the physician and patient involved at that time. So you got to know what you're taking and how often to take it. Those particular regulations, though, that should have the relatively few experts available to modify a given state's qualifying conditions as the new data allows is important for keeping up with that new data, so that you don't have to wait necessarily for a legislative body to come to political terms when in fact healthcare experts might be able to add or remove certain conditions from a given state's qualifying conditions. And then finally, resourcing highly qualified guidance in the dispensing and the thoughtful data processing of this particular medicine is right now at a critical state, because the person behind the counter should, could, and in many situations will in the future be forced to be a trained individual. That's not to say at this moment trained pharmacists that are degreed are ready to fill this void, but a similar training or oversight should advance in that direction for expertise, especially that's what pharmacists, as perhaps an underutilized and underappreciated resource in this space, should be better appreciated. So finally then, in conclusion, there is a take-home message. And the take-home message is where we are at politically, science-wise, legislatively. And that take-home message really is that at this moment in time, cannabis, whether used recreationally in the past, present, or future, is a temptation for many, and it's an indulgence, but it offers certain choices. And those of you familiar with the genie parable, where you get two wishes, and that genie gives you that third wish, which can be the gotcha one. We right now are in a position to be very careful with what we wish for and how we plan on we'd like to have it available or regulated. Because the message here from the talk in this keynote is that science and reason really do matter. So for more information on this, as you may need, I can be reached through Nurturing Nature Group. That's the consultancy that I run. And I'd be happy to hear from you, and hopefully we'll be able to link that way for future information. Thanks for your time.